Hey guys, welcome back, or maybe just welcome. If this is your first time drifting into one of these late-night history rambles, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let your brain float into neutral. Tonight we're going to talk about something that sounds fun but was actually kind of sad in a wow, medieval life really was that bleak kind of way. And that's how peasants in the Middle Ages managed to be just a little bit drunk all day, every day, without really knowing it. Now, you might imagine peasants staggering around their muddy villages like extras in a tavern brawl scene from Game of Thrones. But the truth is a lot less cinematic. It wasn't about chugging giant flagons of ale because life was a non-stop party. It was because their drink of choice, basically their only drink of choice, was weak, fermented, and about as unavoidable as air. Yes, we're talking about good old medieval beer, sometimes called small beer, though it was really more like sad beer. See, the average medieval peasant didn't exactly have a Brita filter handy. Water, especially around towns or villages where people and animals were busy, existing wasn't very safe. And by not safe, I mean if you drank it straight, you'd be setting yourself up for a delightful mix of dysentery, parasites, and whatever else was floating downstream that day. So instead of risking it, people turned to brewing. Boiling the water, mixing in grains, and letting fermentation do its thing created a liquid that was way safer. Sure, it had alcohol in it, but it was usually very weak, maybe 1 or 2%. About the same as a light beer today, or maybe that kombucha bottle you forgot in the back of your fridge a little too long. The funny part is they didn't really frame this as drinking beer. For peasants, it was just daily hydration. Breakfast, beer. Midday meal, beer. After plowing fields all day, yep, more beer. Kids drank it too. Because why not share the tipsy hydration with your 6-year-old? Don't worry, it wasn't strong enough to turn them into miniature barflies. It was just enough to keep everyone a little buzzed while avoiding cholera. Now, the brewing itself was usually done at home, often by women. In fact, some historians argue that the original alewives were kind of the ancestors of bartenders, brewers, and maybe even your quirky hipster friend who insists on home brewing in their garage. These women brewed in small batches, using whatever grain was available. Barley if you were lucky, oats or rye if you weren't. Hops, which give modern beer that bitter taste, weren't common yet. Instead, people flavored their beer with random herbs, roots, or just nothing at all. So, imagine a warm, cloudy, slightly sour oat soup with a splash of alcohol. Refreshing. What's interesting is that peasants didn't even think of it as intoxicating. They weren't getting drunk in the way we think of it. Being mildly tipsy was just the baseline for existence. You'd be slightly wobbly while tending your sheep, a little giggly during church, but not falling over in the mud. It was like walking around with a permanent low-level buzz, which, to be fair, probably helped take the edge off life when your biggest luxury was not having the plague that week. And yes, people did notice when someone actually got drunk, because that required effort. You'd have to consume a ridiculous amount of the weak stuff, or get your hands on strong beer brewed for festivals or holidays. That was usually reserved for feasts, weddings, or those rare moments when everyone collectively agreed, yep, life is miserable. Let's get properly smashed about it. Let's drift over now to another angle of this story. What it actually meant for daily life, how much beer they were really drinking, and why this hazy lifestyle made perfect sense in a world where sobriety wasn't exactly an option. So, how much beer are we really talking about here? Well, brace yourself. Records suggest that in some parts of Europe, the average adult peasant could consume 2 to 3 liters of small beer per day. And yes, that's per person. Imagine carrying a wooden tankard around like it was a reusable water bottle. Except instead of staying hydrated with something crisp and clear, you're sipping on lukewarm barley soup that makes you slightly tipsy. Honestly, not the worst way to survive a medieval Monday, but not exactly refreshing either. The thing is, nobody thought this was strange. If you lived back then, the concept of water being a safe, everyday drink would have sounded suspicious. You'd probably look at someone filling a cup straight from a stream and think, oh, cool. Enjoy your slow and painful death. Meanwhile, your kids are happily sipping their own tiny mugs of ale at the breakfast table. Family bonding at its finest. Now, beer wasn't the only fermented option. In wine-growing regions like France or Italy, peasants might have had access to watered-down wine instead. Again, not the fancy kind, the equivalent of the dregs left after nobles had their parties. But wine worked the same way. Safer than water, just boozy enough to keep you mellow, and endlessly available. But in much of Northern Europe, beer was king. Cheap, filling, and most importantly, liquid bread. And speaking of bread, that was another reason beer was so central. Grains were the backbone of the medieval diet. If you weren't eating them in bread form, you were drinking them in beer form. Nothing went to waste. Even leftover mash from brewing could be baked into dense loaves. Imagine pairing a barley beer with a barley bread sandwich. Exciting culinary variety was not on the peasant menu. But let's talk about the side effects. Living in a constant state of mild buzz does funny things to a society. For one, it made people a little more tolerant of the drudgery of life. Long hours in the field, endless church services, and the occasional outbreak of plague were slightly easier to handle when your baseline was, well, fuzzy. On the flip side, it meant that clarity, sobriety, and sharp decision-making weren't exactly widespread qualities. If you're wondering why so many medieval peasants seemed willing to accept crushing taxes, backbreaking work, and general misery, the answer might partly be they were never fully sober enough to stage a coherent protest. Of course, let's not romanticize it too much. This wasn't some fun craft beer festival stretching across the centuries. It was survival. Beer was calories, hydration, and safety rolled into one. And peasants weren't choosing it because they loved the taste. They chose it because it was the least terrible option available. You weren't going to reach for a refreshing glass of parasite-infested swamp water when you had a safer, if funkier, alternative in your wooden cup. And here's a little ironic twist. Medieval nobles also drank beer, but they could afford the stronger, tastier versions, sometimes flavored with exotic spices or sweetened with honey. Meanwhile, peasants got the budget blend. Basically, history's earliest example of top shelf versus bottom shelf. And just like today, the peasants were stuck with bottom shelf. Because of course they were. Another quirk of this system is how brewing became tied into community and gender roles. As I mentioned earlier, women were usually in charge of household brewing. In some towns, that meant women were constantly juggling childcare, fieldwork, and, oh yes, brewing enough weak beer to keep the family hydrated without poisoning them. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. And sometimes, if a woman was really good at brewing, she might sell the extra to neighbors. Congratulations, you're now an alewife, unofficial village brewer, and probably the most popular person at local feasts. Unless, of course, your beer turned out terrible, in which case you might be accused of witchcraft. Because nothing says neighborly gratitude like blaming someone for demonic sabotage when your ale tastes off. Now, over time, this endless beer consumption shaped culture. Songs, stories, and jokes about drunkenness were common, even though drunkenness really just meant slightly more wobbly than usual. Villages bonded over feasts with stronger beer. Monks brewed higher quality stuff in monasteries, and entire economies were propped up by barley and hops. It was less a hobby and more a lifestyle. So, when we picture medieval peasants stumbling around, it wasn't because they were irresponsible or secretly partying like college freshmen. It was because being low-level buzzed was literally the healthiest, most practical way to survive in a world where clean water didn't exist. And maybe that explains a lot about medieval culture. Its weird festivals, its strange humor, and the general sense that everyone was trudging through life in a slightly dazed state. And on that note, maybe next time you sip your fizzy water or your overpriced latte, take a quiet moment to be grateful that you don't need to drink 3 liters of warm barley beer every day just to stay alive. Unless you want to, of course. No judgment.